when a Rolex designer saw how good the Hublot Classic Fusion looked mixing rubber and precious metals, and thought to themselves, you know what, our watches would look great in that combination. And then they implemented that with the Yachtmaster originally in 2015. Were they copying Hublot, or were they making their watch as good as it could be by allowing themselves to be open to influences from outside their own tiny little sphere? I tend to think it was the latter, but this community, when we talk about watches, really struggles with that idea and sees copying where I don't think it really happened. I want to talk about that more after the intro. Hi, I'm Pete McConville. Welcome to my channel where I overanalyze, overthink, and get way too deep into simple little pieces of jewelry that we like to call wristwatches. Okay, so really this all came out of a live stream I was preparing to be part of last week. I was on the Casual Watch Review Sunday Social, and we were going to talk about copies versus compliments, I think the topic was. Did we think that a selection of watches were legitimate and authentic watches that perhaps complemented someone's prior design decision, or did we think they were copies? I hate going on gut.
I've been thinking with my gut since I was 14 years old. And frankly speaking, I've come to the conclusion that my guts have shit for brains.
There is no way of being wrong faster than to go with your gut. So I always think through things like this. And I started to come up with some ideas about how would I decide whether it was a copy or a compliment, or in the context of this video, if someone was copying another watch, or whether they were allowing themselves to be influenced to maximize their watch. And to come up with that idea, to separate that out, I came up with a process which we'll walk through now. As I'm talking through this process, you'll notice I'm going to throw some images up, and those images surround three watches that have kind of been involved in this kind of controversy before. The Bell & Ross BR05, the Zenith Chronomaster Sport, and the couple of Omega Speedmasters that came out last year, one on a rubber strap and one with a green bezel dial. I'm using those. I'm not going to walk through them specifically. I'm just going to put imagery up that kind of illustrates the point I'm making when I go through this process of deciding whether something's a copy or simply the best version of itself. So we're only having this discussion because you've got a watch which reminds you of another watch that looks very similar, that is using a lot of things that you've seen before. The first step in the process of trying to figure out whether this is a copy or not is to park all the external references. Let's just get in front of us the watch we are talking about and just think about that. So in this case, it could be the Bell & Ross BR05, the Chronomaster Sport, Speedmaster, whichever one you've got. Just put that in your mind and exclude everything else. Having done that, ask yourself three questions. The first is this watch I'm looking at part of an existing and well-established family within that brand? Or if it's a new family, does it look like it would be a fairly logical extension of what the brand has done before? Second question is, does this watch, this particular watch, look like all those other watches in those families, or where you think this watch would be if it just followed the normal path of this brand? Third question is, does the watch look good? Does it look like an integrated collection of design ideas to be a harmonious and consistent and coherent design? Having asked yourself those three questions, now allow yourself to consider other watches and the watches that you think that this watch resembles, the common areas, and ask yourself one more question. is that common area? Is that area that is similar between the two watches or between this watch and many other watches? Is it part of an industry-wide trend or a common design trope? Is this something which lots of people are doing? Or conversely, is it something that is specific and unique to one watch and really only that one watch? If you answer yes to all of those questions above, yes, this watch is part of a pre-existing family or where the brand was probably naturally going to go anywhere. Yes, this watch looks pretty much like all the other members of that family from that brand. Yes, this watch looks good and consistent and coherent, and it doesn't look like it's had something alien jammed into it. And yeah, it's what it's added. Yes, it is common to other watches, but it's common to lots of other watches. It's something that is used across the industry. It's a bit of a design trope or a trend. And yeah, this is something you see a fair bit. As I said, if you can say yes to all of those questions, exactly what's the problem? What you're looking at is not a copy. What you're looking at is exactly how design is supposed to be done. You start with your idea, but then you allow yourself to be the best version of that, or you allow that product to be the best version of that by accepting influences, both internal and external. To exclude, to actively turn your back on incorporating things which would make your product better in the name of maintaining some faux authenticity is not a strong design. That's a weak designer. That's a poor designer. That is someone so lacking in confidence that they don't think their work can sustain influence from outside. A designer that actively hobbles their material because they're afraid that someone will accuse them of copying is weak and is bad, and their products are not as good as they should be. If you look at the three examples I mentioned at the beginning and the imagery I've been putting up, you can see in the BR01, in the Chronosport, and with the Speedmasters, they all looked like products of that company. The BR05 can only be a Bell & Ross. No other company makes a watch that looks like that. Yes, it has similarities to other watches because there's a bunch of watches with that trope. Likewise, the Chronomaster Sport, make a mood board of Chronomasters and it looks like every other Zenith. Likewise, if you do the same with the Speedmasters. Those examples, obviously, clearly, when you slow down, when you forget the shit your gut gives you and you use your brain and think through the problem, you can see that they are, clearly they've accepted influence from outside, but they are not copies of any watch. Okay, so as I said, I think it's actually pretty easy then to see the difference between who's just stealing like an artist and being influenced and those people who are just plain old stealing and copying. Why is it that people get it wrong so many times and see copying where it's obviously not occurring? The first is, as I've referred to it already, many commentators simply don't think. They go with their guts, and as I said, there's no way of getting it wrong faster than to go with a gut call. The next big mistake that people make is that as soon as they see a similarity between two watches, instead of focusing on the new watch, they immediately actually focus on the one that came before it. And instead of imagining how does this Speedmaster look like every other Speedmaster, they become focused on how does this Zenith Chronomaster look like a Daytona, and they start actively excluding all the information that makes it different because they've already started looking just for the similarities. As a result, they forget the fact that this Chronomaster looks like every other Chronomaster ever made, and they get really hung up on one or two details of similarity with another watch. The third mistake that a lot of people make is that they associate industry trends or design tropes with the big player that they are familiar with. So they'll tend to think in terms of, I didn't notice that color was a big thing until I saw that Rolex was doing it. Therefore, I'm going to assume that anyone after that that introduces a line of colorful watches must have been copying Rolex. That's just wrong factually. Rolex was just another brand in that industry space, but a lot of commentators simply don't notice it because they don't see anything that happens outside of their favorite brands. And so what are in fact industry-wide trends, they think are unique to their favorite brands because that's the first and only time they saw it. The fourth thing, that mistake that people make is that they see the watch industry, and maybe this isn't so much a mistake as a mindset. Their mindset is that the watch industry is a competitive rather than an artistic space. And for them, it's all about creating hierarchies and status and tier lists and rankings and all that rubbish. And trying to put watches and designs in a chronological order and award merit based on sort of who's closest to the top of that chronological order is a cheap and easy way of reinforcing your ideas of where am I going to put who on these stupid tier lists. It's sort of like when you back out of that idea and start asking yourself, here's a trick you can play. Jump into like YouTube or something like that and try and find a tier list of abstract expressionists, a tier list of impressionists. When you're in art, this idea of creating tiers and structures and who came first would be laughed at. And yet we do it routinely here and we're the poorer for it. So what would I say? I would say the next time a watch comes out and you start to see similarities and you feel that urge to say this watch is a copy of, slow down, tell your gut to stop thinking for you, engage your brain and then walk through this process. Do that and this hobby becomes so much more fun and so much more enjoyable. And that's what I've started to do. And one of the things I've noticed is I just don't see copying anymore. I am enjoying the hobby way more since I started like imposing these rules on how I work. And I can't recommend highly enough that you do too. Anyway, as I said, I've been Pete McConville. This is me rambling on, overthinking, overanalyzing watches. Hope you enjoyed that. If you enjoy more of this kind of thinking, I'll like, subscribe, and do all that sort of stuff. Please comment. Tell me below if you think you disagree with me. We'll enter into a dialogue. If you go back and look at my other videos, you'll see I answer a huge percentage of the comments. And as I said, I'll see you later. Bye.